Ferrari have had an incredible year of winning iconic races, but none of them were in Formula 1. The 296 GT3 won the 24 Hours of Nürburgring and set the distance record, and the Ferrari 499P won at Le Mans. Yes, I do remember Singapore, but please stay with me. But we're talking about this thing, the incredible 1,000 horsepower four-wheel drive hybrid hypercar that won in its first year, defeating the giants of Le Mans, Toyota and Porsche. They did all this through several incredible engineering decisions and one key difference from their Formula 1 team. Let me explain. Now, we know that Ferrari's F1 team have recently been struggling with a car that is quick over one lap but doesn't have great race pace. They also haven't really been the sharpest of decision makers when it comes to race strategy.
We are checking that. Okay, we are checking.
We'll come back to you.
But the 499P, the new Ferrari hypercar that was unveiled last year, needed to nail those things. They had one goal: create a competitive hypercar that could win at Le Mans, over 50 years since their last win in the top class. So they had to create something that was reliable, kind on its tyres, and could be fast over 24 hours. We're going to get into the incredible engineering in this thing, but quickly let me explain why Ferrari are here in the first place. Because whilst I've had GT cars running at Le Mans for years, they haven't entered the top class of sports cars for a long time, and it's a strange change of pace for them. But it actually came about due to Formula 1. Pre-2021, Ferrari was spending just over $400 million a year to develop their cars and run their F1 team. But in 2021, the cost cap limited them to only spending $145 million. So they had some cash left over. At the same time, WEC, the World Endurance Championship, was changing its very expensive LMP1 regulations to do a similar thing, make racing a bit cheaper so they could attract more competitors. So Ferrari saw this as an opportunity. Firstly, to try and go and win in another class of racing. Secondly, to get more exposure from that. And thirdly, and most interestingly, they could experiment with more motorsport technology that could help the F1 team, but outside of the cost cap. And that is a very clever strategy. So once Ferrari decided to enter the Le Mans Hyperclass, or LMH, they had to design a race car from scratch. The first piece of the puzzle was the monocoque, the carbon tub that everything else is built around. Where competitors like Porsche had bought in a monocoque, Ferrari designed their own from scratch, focusing on making it as slimline as possible for greater freedom with aerodynamics. Then they paired it with their V6 engine from the 296 road car, and this was an interesting decision. The engine was a good match for the car, a 3-litre twin-turbo V6 from the 296 GTB and GTS road cars. And what's great about this engine, it's already designed to work with a hybrid motor, like the 296 road car. It's already producing more than enough power, and it's a 120-degree V angle. This is ideal for a couple of reasons. A nice wide V angle means that the engine is wider, but it's also flatter, so the centre of gravity is lower in the car. It also helps with packaging. Ferrari actually put the turbos inside the V, which is known as a hot V. With a 6-cylinder engine, a 120-degree angle allows for a perfectly even firing order. But why does that matter? Well, basically, a 4-stroke engine creates power over 2 full revolutions, so 720 degrees of crank rotation. For a 6-cylinder engine, you divide that by 6, leaving you with 120 degrees. An even firing order sounds smoother, minimises vibrations, and provides more even pulses of exhaust gases to the turbochargers. Now, you might be wondering about the power output from this engine. You might be thinking that Ferrari created a high-strung engine that runs at 800, 900 or 1000 horsepower. But the hypercar class has a few weird but great rules. And there'll be a few of those rules throughout this video, rules that don't make sense on the surface but do create better racing overall. So in the hypercar class, the internal combustion engine is limited to 500 kilowatts. That's 670 horsepower. So that's what the engine produces. So Ferrari have some headroom, which allows them to focus on reliability. But there was one main problem for Ferrari. This engine wasn't made to be a stressed member of the car. And this is where the engine forms part of the load-bearing chassis, because in the road car, there is a chassis frame holding the engine. So Ferrari had to make a number of changes to the engine casing to ensure it could deal with the loads of racing, as well as making sure it could do that for 24 hours. However, they aim to keep as much of the internals the same, helping develop the road car engine and supporting the development for the Formula 1 V6 as well. Then there's the hybrid system. This is made up of a 900-volt battery, the same core system in the F1 car, as well as the MG UK motor powering the front wheels through a differential. This thing makes 200 kilowatts, the equivalent of around 270 horsepower. But it can do this in deployment and regeneration. That's the whine you can hear under braking, the MGU whirring away and charging the battery. This makes the combined power output of the car over 900 horsepower. Except there's another weird but good rule. The cars are limited to a combined 700 horsepower limit at any one time. So the motor is used to fill in for when the engine isn't creating peak power. It's an extremely complex system that has to decide when to use the hybrid power. And another thing, the motor powers the front wheels. But the hypercars are not allowed to deploy this power below 190 kilometers an hour, or 120 miles per hour. And this is for one good reason. When the FIA was trying to attract more hypercar entrants, not everyone wanted to develop a full hypercar. So they allowed the LMDH Le Mans Daytona Hybrid cars to enter from the US-based IMSA series. This is all very complicated. These are more standardized cars that run with a hybrid system on the rear wheels. So, to avoid giving the hypercars a massive advantage, the rules state that the four-wheel drive cars and the two-wheel drive cars can only use their hybrid deployment over a certain speed to have a fairer overall class of racing. It's complicated and it's weird, but having runaway winners is boring, so I actually really like this idea. And it's the same thing with the maximum power. It allows all of the manufacturers to use engines that are applicable to their road cars, meaning there is a great variety of engines. Cadillac, BMW, Lamborghini and Glickenhaus have V8s, Ferrari, Peugeot and Toyota have turbo V6s. But this rule does bring in one weird dynamic for the drivers. Through most of the corners, they are driving essentially a rear-wheel drive car that behaves like any other race car. But some of the corners at Le Mans have a minimum corner speed of more than 190 kilometers per hour, places like the Porsche curves and Dunlop. So the drivers need to factor in the additional understeer from the four-wheel drive deployment through those specific corners, and that must be really challenging. Now, Ferrari hasn't won in the top class at Le Mans since 1965, with the incredible Ferrari 250 LM. So, the aerodynamic design of the 499P. And this is where Ferrari went with a different design to their competitors. Some context, here is the Toyota, Peugeot, Glickenhaus, Porsche and Cadillac. All of Ferrari's main rivals have gone for a smooth, sleek and low-drag looking cars. Ferrari, on the other hand, have an angular, aggressive-looking car. And I think it looks incredible against a bunch of already great-looking cars in the hypercar class. But just look at this. Notice all of the vertical strakes on the car. These are ideas brought across from Formula 1, and there's a clever plan behind these. So let me explain another weird but good rule from the FIA. These hypercars don't have geometric limits on their splitters, wings or bodywork, like you would have in Formula 1. Instead, they have limits on aerodynamic efficiency. And it's super clever. Essentially, you can't have too much downforce or too little drag. The FIA measure the cars in the wind tunnel before the event, and if your aero is too good, you have to change the car. And the best bit is that these targets are actually pretty easy to hit. So, for example, Peugeot don't even have a rear wing, because they don't need one to be able to hit the downforce target. So, Ferrari saw this and we think they noticed something. These downforce numbers are measured in a straight line, but you actually want the downforce in the corners. So these vertical strakes could be to maximize cornering downforce whilst meeting the straight line regulations. This obviously isn't confirmed, but it could be a clever idea if we're right. So how has this car been getting on? Well, for its first WEC season, pretty good. It got a third in its first event behind the two Toyotas, and a couple of podiums leading up to Le Mans. But the main thing to know here is that Toyota are a full season ahead of them in terms of development. So are Glickenhaus and to an extent, Peugeot. So Ferrari turned up to Le Mans as an underdog, but this helped them. Lastly, in our list of weird but good rules is BOP, balance of performance. It's something they have in sports car racing to balance out the cars. It opens up a wider breadth of cars into the sport. Take a look at this. The BMW M8 GTE was racing against the Ford GT. Two very different looking cars, but made even by BOP. Anyway, for Le Mans, the BOP landed favourably for Ferrari, only getting 24 kilograms of extra weight, where Toyota got handed 36 kilograms after winning the first 3 rounds of the WEC Championship. So these things were set for Le Mans. The underdog was ready to go. Ferrari led all of the practice sessions, and Fuoco took pole in the Ferrari, with Pierre Guidi in second. The Ferrari was quickest on the long straights, hitting 343 kilometers down the Mulsanne straight. However, the entire hypercar field was covered by less than a second, and on a long circuit like Le Mans, that is not a lot. Now, before I get into the race, I must mention one thing I spoke about earlier. There's one big difference between Ferrari's F1 team and Ferrari's sports car team. In the sports car program, the car is developed with Ferrari. The race team is run by AF Corsa, a highly experienced, well-oiled machine of a race team, who also ran the Ferrari GTE team before this. And I mention this because of the strategy at the start of the race. The Ferrari led from pole, but within the first lap the rain started to come down, but only lightly. After the second lap, both Toyotas managed to overtake the Ferraris for the lead. This was down to the Toyotas starting on the soft tyre, where the Ferraris started on the medium. In the rain, the soft was by far the better tyre. And this was starting to look like a Ferrari strategy clanger. But over the first 2 stints, the medium tyre became the best tyre, as the track dried out and the soft tyre wore out quickly. The Ferraris came back at the Toyotas. The strategy, pit stops and general running from the AF Corsa team was flawless. After the 3rd stint, James Calado, a super experienced GT driver, hopped out the car and in stepped Antonio Giovinazzi. Now, we know this guy as an ex-Formula 1 driver, but this season he's been incredible in the hypercar class. He tore through the field after the pit stop and even handled a torrential downpour that saw many cars flying off the circuit. The Ferrari overall had the pace on the Toyotas, Peugeots and Porsches, but the main difference was the reliability, experiencing only one small issue throughout the race, where they had to run a power cycle in the pit stop. But compared to their competitors, this wasn't really much. The 51 car of Collado, Giovinazzi and Pierre Guidi run the race, taking home the top class win for Ferrari, the first time at Le Mans in over 55 years. This car was incredible for its first time out at Le Mans. The driving, the strategy, the tyre wear, the pace and the reliability were all pretty much flawless. Surprising for a Ferrari race car if you're an F1 fan. Check out this video on the incredible diesel Audi Le Mans car just here, and I'll catch you in the next one.